The $5 espresso was a bitter, steaming insult to a $50 million empire, yet Alessandro Vieri watched the dark liquid swirl with more focus than he had ever given a federal indictment. Concrete dust and the metallic tang of the city's industrial rot usually defined his mornings, but here, inside the cramped, wood-paneled confines of the Gilded Bean, the air was thick with the scent of slow-roasted beans and burnt sugar. Alessandro sat in a corner booth, his tailored Italian overcoat a stark, dark shadow against the cafe's peeling wallpaper. To the world outside, he was a man of sharp angles and colder calculations, a predator who owned the streets and the souls who walked them. He had come to this neighborhood to finalize a predatory land grab that would level this entire block, replacing these grease-stained trenches with a high-rise monument to his own greed. But then she arrived. Isabella Cruz moved through the small cafe with a practiced, frantic rhythm that Alessandro found uncomfortably hypnotic. She wasn't looking at the black Lincoln Navigator idling at the curb or the heavily built underbosses flanking the entrance with flint-colored eyes. She was focused on the steam rising from the espresso machine and the shivering workers lined up for their morning caffeine. When she finally approached his table, she didn't flinch. She didn't defer to the terror he usually inspired. Instead, she set the chipped porcelain cup down with a warm, genuine smile that seemed to momentarily thaw the freezing atmosphere of the room. "Careful," she murmured, her voice carrying an edge of resilience that Alessandro hadn't expected. "It's stronger than it looks." Alessandro took a sip, the heat searing his tongue. Something entirely foreign shifted inside his chest. It wasn't just the caffeine. It was an acute fascination with the woman standing before him. In a world where every man was a liar and every contract was a hit, Isabella Cruz was fighting her own war in a tiny, bean-scented trench, completely oblivious to the fact that the man drinking her coffee was the one sent to destroy her. As the rich, savory flavor settled, Alessandro realized the calculation had changed. He had come to sign a death warrant for this cafe, but as he looked into Isabella's green eyes, the $50 million deal felt suddenly, dangerously insignificant. He didn't just want the land anymore. He wanted to know how a single cup of coffee could make a monster feel like a man. The $50 million deal didn't smell like money. It smelled like burnt espresso and cheap floor wax. Alessandro Vieri stepped out of the black Lincoln Navigator, his polished Oxfords crunching over the grime of a sidewalk the city had long ago forgotten. He didn't look at the crumbling brickwork or the flickering neon sign of the Gilded Bean. He looked through them. To Alessandro, this wasn't a neighborhood. It was a strategic hole in his portfolio, a final square of grit to be paved over with glass and steel. He moved with the heavy, unhurried gait of a man who owned the air he breathed. His underboss, a wall of muscle named Marco, flanked him, his eyes scanning the street for the ghost of a threat that never dared to manifest. Alessandro pushed open the heavy glass door, the jingle of a rusted bell cutting through the low hum of the morning rush. The interior was a grease-stained trench, a cramped, wood-panel box that felt entirely out of place against his tailored Italian overcoat. Alessandro scanned the room with eyes the color of flint. He was here for the deed, not the atmosphere. His mind was already consumed by percentages and the offshore accounts that would swallow the profits of the high-rise project slated to rise from this very spot. He took a seat in a corner booth, the vinyl cracking under his weight. He was a predator in a porcelain shop, waiting to finalize a predatory land grab that would level the block. Then she approached. Isabella Cruz didn't walk. She moved with a practiced, frantic rhythm, weaving through the shivering workers with a grace that felt like a direct challenge to the cold calculations in Alessandro's head. She carried a chipped porcelain cup, the steam rising in a lazy coil that mimicked the slow-braised richness he had smelled at the construction site. She set the cup down in front of him. There was no terror in her eyes, no stutter in her hands. She looked at the man who could end her livelihood with a stroke of a pen and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Black. No sugar," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the noisy room. Alessandro didn't answer. He watched her hand, red-knuckled from the cold and the steam, retreat to her apron. Something entirely foreign shifted inside his chest. He had come to sign a death warrant for this tiny, bean-scented trench, but as the bitter, savory scent of the $5 espresso hit him, the $50 million empire felt suddenly, dangerously distant. For the first time in 5 years, the undisputed head of the family wasn't thinking about the payout. He was thinking about the woman who wasn't afraid to look him in the eye. The black navigator sat idling at the curb, a predatory shark in a shallow pool of urban decay. Inside, Alessandro Vieri adjusted the cuff of his tailored overcoat, his eyes fixed on the cracked facade of the Gilded Bean. To the rest of the city, this block was a collection of crumbling brick and broken dreams, but to Alessandro's syndicate, it was a $50 million obstacle. He had come to finalize a predatory land grab, a move designed to level these grease-stained trenches and replace them with the glass and steel coldness of a high-rise development. Concrete dust and the metallic tang of diesel fumes usually masked the stench of the corruption he dealt in, but as Alessandro pushed open the heavy glass door, the atmosphere shifted. The jingle of a rusted bell cut through the low hum of the morning, and suddenly, the acrid smell of the city was gone. It was replaced by something rich, savory, and entirely out of place, the scent of slow-roasted beans and simmering sugar. It was a scent of grace that felt like a direct insult to his colder calculations. He moved through the cramped, wood-paneled space with the heavy gait of a man who owned the streets. His underboss, Marco, stood by the entrance, a flint-eyed sentinel in a room full of shivering workers who just wanted to stay warm. Alessandro took a seat in a corner booth, the vinyl cracking under the weight of his authority. He was a predator in a porcelain shop, his mind consumed by percentages and offshore accounts, yet he couldn't stop his gaze from drifting toward the woman behind the counter. Isabella Cruz moved with a practiced, frantic rhythm, her dark hair escaping in damp tendrils as she worked the espresso machine. She was a widow fighting her own war in this tiny trench, oblivious to the fact that the man in the corner held the pen that would sign her eviction. When she finally approached his table, she didn't flinch at his sharp angles or the heavy silence that followed him. She simply set a chipped porcelain cup of espresso down, the steam rising in a lazy, inviting coil. "Black. No sugar," she said, her voice carrying an edge of resilience that momentarily thawed the bitter chill of Alessandro's business. Alessandro took a sip. The heat seared his tongue, but the flavor was a revelation. Something entirely foreign shifted inside his chest. He had come to destroy this block, but as he looked at Isabella, completely unafraid and focused on her labor, the $50 million deal felt suddenly, dangerously distant. The king of the city had found a scent he couldn't buy and a woman he couldn't intimidate. The bell above the door chimed with a frantic, rhythmic persistence, a sound that echoed the practiced speed of Isabella's hands. While Alessandro sat in the corner, a silent predator draped in a tailored Italian overcoat, Isabella fought her own war in the grease-stained trench of the kitchen. She wasn't just flipping burgers or ladling heavy scoops of baked ziti into styrofoam containers. She was holding back the tide of a collapsing life. Every $10 container she handed over was a small victory against the rising debts that threatened to drown the Gilded Bean. The steam from the flat-top grill clung to her face, dampening the auburn tendrils that escaped her utilitarian bun, but she didn't slow down. Her green eyes, though etched with an exhaustion that made her look older than 32, never lost their focus. She moved with a frantic energy, her mind a frantic tally of past due notices and the sheer cost of keeping the lights on in a neighborhood being swallowed by the bitter chill of corporate greed. In the back of the van, her small boy sat on an overturned milk crate, wrapped in an oversized winter coat, diligently coloring. He was the reason she stood shivering in the cold, the reason she ignored the colder calculations of the predators circling her city. To the construction workers outside, she was a source of warmth and a genuine smile that thawed the freezing air. To the world of offshore accounts and multi-million-dollar laundering Alessandro represented, she was an invisible obstacle. She wasn't just selling food, she was protecting a sanctuary. Every dollar of change she handed back was a bullet fired in a war of resilience. She was oblivious to the sharp angles of the man watching her from the booth, unaware that his syndicate's money laundering portfolio was the very engine designed to level her life. Isabella didn't need a black Lincoln Navigator to command respect. She commanded it through the sheer, stubborn grit of a woman who refused to let her son's world go cold, even as the stench of corruption closed in around her. The chipped porcelain cup felt small and fragile against Alessandro's scarred knuckles, a stark contrast to the heavy weight of the world he usually carried. He lifted the espresso, the heat radiating through his palm, while his gaze remained locked on Isabella. She had already moved on, her practiced, frantic rhythm carrying her back to the steam-hissing machine, but the air she left behind remained thick with the scent of grace. Alessandro took his first sip. The liquid was dark, intense, and scorched his tongue with a profile that was entirely foreign to the mass-produced bitterness of the corporate world. It wasn't just coffee. It was a concentrated dose of the resilience he had been watching. As the heat settled in his throat, a sharp, unfamiliar sensation shifted inside his chest. This wasn't the cold calculation of a multi-million-dollar laundering operation or the adrenaline of a bloody internal war. This was a visceral, human connection to a woman who was fighting her own war in a tiny, grease-stained trench. He looked down at the dark swirl in the cup, then back at the woman who had served it with a warm, genuine smile that seemed to ignore the predators circling her city. In that moment, the $50 million empire felt like a hollow shell of gravel and mud. For a man who owned the steel and the unions, the realization was jarring. He had spent his life building monuments to his power, yet he had never tasted anything as honest as this $5 espresso. The bitter chill of the city still clawed at the windows, and the black Lincoln Navigator waited outside like a tether to his violent reality. But as Alessandro drained the cup, the sharp angles of his mind began to blur. He had come to the Gilded Bean to execute a death warrant for the block, to be the monster the world expected him to be. Instead, the simple act of drinking Isabella's coffee had done the impossible. It had forced a predator to stop and see the person standing in his path. The taste of her labor had done what no federal indictment ever could. It had made him hesitate. Alessandro Vieri, the undisputed head of the family, was no longer thinking about the buyout. He was wondering how much it would cost to make sure this woman never lost her smile. Alessandro stepped out of the cafe, the lingering heat of the espresso still a steady pulse in his chest. Outside, the bitter chill of the Boston wind had returned, but it no longer felt quite so sharp. His gaze, the color of flint, swept the perimeter of the block. He didn't see a development site anymore. He saw a fortress under siege. "Marco," Alessandro murmured, his voice a low vibration that made his underboss instantly straighten. "There are vultures on this block. Pickpockets and union thugs trying to bleed the payroll. Clear them." Marco nodded, knowing the colder calculations of his boss usually meant a body count, but the instruction today was different. Alessandro didn't want a war. He wanted a perimeter. Across the street, 3 heavily built men from Local 44, Arthur Pendleton's personal heavies, were leaning against a rusted sedan, watching the cafe's door with predatory intent. They were there to skim off the top, to lean on Isabella for protection money she didn't have. They moved with the arrogance of men who thought they owned the mud and gravel of the streets. Alessandro watched from the shadow of his black Navigator as Marco and 2 other men crossed the pavement. There was no shouting, no loud confrontation, just the swift, practiced, frantic rhythm of professional intimidation. Marco leaned in close to the lead thug, his hand resting casually on the man's shoulder, a grip that promised a bloody internal war if they didn't vanish. Within seconds, the 3 men were back in their car, tires spinning as they fled the acrid smell of the site. Inside the cafe, Isabella remained completely oblivious to the predators being chased from her doorstep. She continued her war in a tiny, grease-stained trench, ladling ziti and handing back change with a warm, genuine smile. She didn't know that the undisputed head of the family was now her invisible shield. Alessandro watched her through the glass for a final moment. He was still the man of sharp angles, but the percentages had changed. He wasn't just a predator anymore. He was a guardian. He had come to derail her life, but as he signaled the driver to move, he realized he would destroy anyone who tried to touch the Gilded Bean. The $50 million deal was a ghost. The only thing that mattered was the woman who lived behind the steam. The city's shadows had eyes, and they were trained on the corner of the block where the black navigator lingered too long. For Alessandro Vieri, silence was usually a sign of total control, but tonight, the silence felt heavy, like the air before a terminal lung shot. Word had traveled through the grease-stained trenches of the underworld. The rumors were whispered in the backrooms of social clubs and over encrypted lines. The flint-eyed head of the Vieri family had grown soft. He wasn't just stalling a $50 million buyout. He was clearing the streets for a widow with a chipped porcelain cup. Inside the Gilded Bean, Isabella was closing up, her practiced, frantic rhythm finally slowing as the last of the dinner rush faded. She wiped down the counters, oblivious to the bitter chill of the eyes watching her from across the street. She didn't see the dark sedan with the tinted windows or the way it rolled slowly past the cafe, its engine a low, predatory growl. The strike didn't come from the front. It came from the alley, a calculated move by a rival faction looking to derail Alessandro's empire by striking at his new, uncharacteristic weakness. Two men, their faces obscured by the collars of heavy canvas jackets, stepped out of the gloom. They didn't carry the sharp angles of professional soldiers. They carried the blunt violence of message senders. They weren't there to kill. They were there to burn the sanctuary to the ground. One man gripped a heavy brick, ready to shatter the glass that held Isabella's warm, genuine smile. The other held a canister, the acrid smell of gasoline beginning to mask the scent of slow-roasted beans. They moved with a jagged, nervous energy, unaware that they were stepping into a trap set by a man who had already traded his colder calculations for a lethal sense of protection. Just as the first arm pulled back to throw, the bitter chill of the alley was cut by a sound like a whip crack. Marco appeared from the darkness, a silent sentinel who had never left his post. The confrontation was short, brutal, and devoid of mercy. There was no room for negotiation when it came to the tiny trench Alessandro had sworn to guard. As the rivals scrambled back into the night, leaving behind the stench of failed intent, Isabella paused inside, looking toward the dark window. She felt a shiver, a sudden, foreign shift of intuition, but she saw nothing but her own reflection in the glass. She didn't know that a war had just been fought for her storefront, or that Alessandro was already blocks away, his mind consumed by percentages of a different kind, the rising cost of keeping her world from going cold. The Gilded Bean was a sanctuary of steam and toasted sugar, but the illusion of safety shattered with the sound of a heavy boot against the front door. Isabella was reaching for a fresh bag of beans when the glass exploded inward, showering the floor in jagged diamonds. Two men stormed in, their canvas jackets smelling of diesel and cold sweat. They didn't look like customers, they looked like the predators Alessandro had spent weeks silently chasing away. "Where is he?" one of them barked, his voice a jagged rasp that made the small boy in the back drop his crayons. "Where's Vieri's little pet?" Isabella stood frozen, the practiced, frantic rhythm of her workday replaced by a paralyzing terror. She had spent her life fighting a war in a tiny, grease-stained trench, but this was a violence she didn't understand. Before she could speak, the black Lincoln Navigator screeched to a halt outside. Alessandro Vieri didn't just walk through the door. He entered like a storm of sharp angles and colder calculations. The air in the cafe instantly turned to bitter chill. Alessandro didn't look at the intruders with fear. He looked at them with the flint-eyed detachment of a man who owned the streets they stood on. "Out," Alessandro said, his voice a low, lethal murmur. The taller man laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "You've gone soft, Vieri. Protecting a waitress? The family is laughing at you." In a blur of movement that Isabella's eyes could barely follow, the undisputed head of the family crossed the room. There was no negotiation. With a brutal efficiency that spoke of a bloody internal war, Alessandro disarmed the man, the sound of breaking bone sickeningly loud in the quiet shop. He didn't stop until the intruders were dragged out into the mud and gravel of the sidewalk, where Marco was waiting to finish the clearance. Alessandro turned back to Isabella, his tailored Italian overcoat stained with a spray of crimson that didn't belong to him. The warm, genuine smile she usually reserved for him died on her lips. She looked at his scarred knuckles, then at the black car outside, and finally into eyes that were no longer just those of a customer. "You're him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Vieri syndicate. You're the one who's been buying the block." The scent of grace was gone, replaced by the acrid smell of the truth. Alessandro stood in the center of her shattered sanctuary, a monster caught in the light. He had come to protect her, but in doing so, he had destroyed the only thing she valued more than her café, the belief that he was just a man. Their worlds had finally collided, and as Isabella pulled her son close, Alessandro realized that his colder calculations had cost him the only warmth he had ever known. The bitter chill of the morning air was thick with the acrid smell of wet asphalt and impending violence. Alessandro Vieri stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the Gilded Bean, his tailored Italian overcoat buttoned tight against a wind that felt like a bloody internal war. Facing him was a wall of black SUVs and men with flint-colored eyes, the high-ranking elders of the Rinaldi syndicate. They weren't there for a photo opportunity. They were there for the crown jewel of their laundering portfolio. "The contract is ready, Alessandro," the lead elder rasped, his voice cutting through the diesel fumes of the idling engines. "Sign the buyout. The demolition crews are 2 blocks away. This grease-stained trench ends today." Alessandro looked at the chipped porcelain cup sitting forgotten on the outdoor bistro table, then back at the glass door where Isabella stood. She was holding her son tight, her green eyes no longer filled with a warm, genuine smile, but with the exhaustion of a woman who finally saw the predator in her midst. He was a man composed of sharp angles and colder calculations, but the percentages in his head had been derailed by the scent of slow-roasted beans. If he signed, he kept his status as the undisputed head of the family. If he refused, he was a traitor to the multi-million-dollar laundering operation he had built. The syndicate didn't tolerate softness. To choose Isabella's safety was to invite a federal indictment or a casket. The foundation must be poured, the elder pressured, echoing the notoriously greedy demands of the unions. Alessandro reached into his pocket, his scarred knuckles brushing against the cold steel of his pen. He looked at Isabella one last time. She was a resilient fighter in a world that deferred to him out of terror, and for the first time, his colder calculations failed him. With a slow, deliberate motion, Alessandro tore the $50 million contract in half, the sound of the paper ripping like a gunshot in the quiet street. "The block stays," Alessandro said, his voice a low murmur that made the heavily built underbosses physically flinch. He had chosen. He was no longer the king of Sterling Point, or the undisputed head. He was a man standing in the mud and gravel, protecting a woman who had taught him that even a monster could be changed by a $5 espresso. The criminal empire was gone, but as he stepped toward the door, he finally felt the foreign shift in his chest settle into something like peace. Alessandro stood in the center of the grease-stained trench, the bitter chill of his former life finally fading. The black SUVs had retreated, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with colder calculations, but light with a newfound resilience. He looked at the chipped porcelain cup in his scarred knuckles, realizing that the crown jewel of his empire wasn't a $2 billion high-rise, but the warm, genuine smile of the woman standing before him. Isabella didn't move toward him with the terror he was used to. Instead, she stepped through the mud and gravel of her shattered sanctuary and placed a hand on his tailored Italian overcoat. It was a gesture of grace that derailed every sharp angle left in his soul. Alessandro realized he could never return to the offshore accounts or the bloody internal wars that had defined him. He was no longer the undisputed head of the family. He was a man who had traded percentages for a foreign shift in his heart. He looked out at the street, seeing not a money-laundering portfolio, but a neighborhood of people fighting their own wars. He would no longer be the predator circling the city. He would be the architect of a new blueprint, one built on protection instead of predation. As the scent of slow-roasted beans filled the air once more, Alessandro knew his transformation was complete. He had walked into the cafe to destroy a life, only to find that the life he truly destroyed was his own, and in its place, something human had finally begun to grow. In a world obsessed with the price of everything, Alessandro finally learned the value of someone. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stop being a monster and start being a man. When you protect a light, you finally stop living in the dark.